The email hit my inbox at 7:12 a.m., stamped urgent like a threat pretending to be professional courtesy. By 7:14, my calendar wiped itself clean, meetings vanishing one by one as if I'd already stopped existing. By 7:16, the CIO was standing behind me, reading my screen over my shoulder, laughing softly. "Boomer spaghetti," he said, shaking his head. "That's what this code is, messy, old, replaceable." What he didn't know, what no one in that glass and chrome office seemed to remember, was that the so-called spaghetti was the nervous system of a $4.2 billion company, and every single strand of it still belonged to me. I'd written the core architecture 15 years earlier, back when the company was still operating out of a converted warehouse and ambition mattered more than buzzwords. No frameworks, no vendor shortcuts, just clean logic designed to survive scale, audits, and bad leadership. I warned them back then. I put it in writing. The intellectual property clause was rejected as too expensive. So we settled on a licensing agreement. My code, their usage, renewable annually, revocable upon termination. Legal had signed it. The board had approved it. Everyone forgot, except me. The CIO, Trevor Hale, was 36 and proud of it. Stanford hoodie energy wrapped in a tailored suit. He believed anything written before cloud-native buzzwords was ancient history. He believed developers expired like milk. He believed that if something worked, it must be simple and therefore easy to replace. When he fired me that morning, it wasn't even personal. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and told me I should embrace retirement energy. He slid the termination packet across the desk and added, "We'll refactor your stuff." "Clean it up, no hard feelings." I signed. Calmly, politely, I shook his hand. I packed my framed team photo, my mechanical keyboard, and the notebook I'd carried since 2009. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. By noon, my badge access was dead, my Slack deactivated, my email forwarding disabled. They thought the story ended there. It didn't. At 12:41 p.m., I sent one email from my personal account to the company's general counsel, the CFO, and the board's compliance inbox. Subject line, notice of license termination effective immediately. Attached, the original licensing agreement, the termination clause highlighted in yellow, and a simple invoice for retroactive overuse based on last quarter's compute metrics. I didn't threaten. I didn't gloat. I simply stated facts. They had 24 hours to cease use of my proprietary code or negotiate a new license. By 1:10 p.m., the trading platform began throwing warnings. By 1:22, batch jobs stalled. By 1:47, customer-facing dashboards froze mid-refresh. Engineers scrambled, blaming AWS, blaming deployments, blaming each other. Trevor called an emergency bridge and demanded answers. There were none. Because refactoring code you don't own and don't understand under live load isn't innovation. It's malpractice. At 2:06 p.m., the CFO finally read my email. At 2:11, legal realized the codebase couldn't be clean room rewritten without violating federal audit trails. At 2:18, the board learned that pulling the system offline, even briefly, would trigger regulatory reporting failures and breach 3 enterprise contracts. At 2:23, Trevor tried to call me. I let it ring. By market close, the company's stock dipped 6% on technical uncertainty. By dinner, they were begging. The tone had changed completely. No more boomer jokes, no more spaghetti metaphors, just panic wrapped in politeness. They offered to reinstate me. I declined. They offered a consulting contract. I countered. Higher rate, shorter hours, full architectural authority, ownership explicitly acknowledged. They accepted in 12 minutes. I returned the following Monday, not as an employee, but as the owner of the system they couldn't survive without. Trevor no longer attended my meetings. He resigned 3 weeks later to pursue other opportunities. The company announced a strategic realignment. My license fees paid off my mortgage by Christmas. They still call the code spaghetti. But now they ask before touching it. The part no one tells you is what happens after the victory, after the panic settles and the power dynamic quietly flips. Walking back into that building felt surreal. Same lobby, same security desk, different badge. The consultant tag clipped to my jacket gave me access to every floor and none of the politics. People who used to talk over me now waited until I finished speaking. Engineers asked questions instead of making assumptions. Meetings ended on time because when you're paying by the hour, suddenly clarity becomes very important. I didn't rewrite the system. I didn't need to. I documented it. Line by line, decision by decision, I explained why things existed the way they did. What was brittle, what was intentionally rigid, what looked inefficient but was legally non-negotiable. Half the boomer spaghetti turned out to be compliance guardrails Trevor had never bothered to learn. The other half was optimization built for scale they hadn't even reached yet. Funny how legacy code always looks messy to people who weren't there when the fire started. What changed most wasn't the technology, it was the respect. Not the loud kind, the careful kind, the kind where people double-check before suggesting replacements, the kind where leadership asks, "What are we not seeing?" instead of declaring, "This is outdated." That respect didn't come from revenge, it came from consequences. Trevor's exit was handled quietly. No announcement, no farewell post. One day his office was empty, the next his name disappeared from org charts and JIRA tickets. I heard later he'd taken a role at a startup promising to disrupt legacy systems. I wished him luck. Sincerely, disruption is expensive when you don't read the fine print. As for me, I stopped chasing relevance. I let my work speak in places where it mattered. I took fewer calls. I billed honestly. I went home before sunset. The company stabilized. The board slept better. The system kept running because it was never the problem. The real lesson wasn't about owning code. It was about owning your leverage and knowing when to use it without burning yourself down. You don't have to shout. You don't have to humiliate anyone. You just have to understand what you built and refuse to let it be dismissed by people who don't understand its cost. They called it spaghetti. I called it proof. Proof has a way of outliving pride. Months passed, and the emergency calls slowed to a trickle. The system ran quietly, doing what it had always done, absorbing stress, smoothing chaos, preventing disasters no dashboard ever showed. New engineers came and went, each one inheriting a cleaner, better documented version of what they once mocked. Some of them figured it out. They didn't laugh at the code. They studied it. Those were the ones who lasted. I started turning down work, not because I couldn't do it, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. My calendar filled selectively, advisory sessions, architecture reviews, short bursts of high-impact decisions. The kind of work that pays for judgment, not endurance. The kind that leaves room to breathe. Every so often, someone would ask why I never pushed back harder when I was still employed. Why I didn't correct Trevor in the meeting or defend the system when it was insulted. The truth was simple. People who belittle what they don't understand aren't looking for conversation. They're looking for permission, and I wasn't interested in giving it to them. The company eventually announced a modernization initiative. New tools, new language, same core logic underneath. They just stopped pretending it was disposable. Leadership changed its tone, less swagger, more listening. They had learned the expensive lesson quietly, the way most organizations do after consequences, not before. I moved on fully not long after. Another contract paid for my kids' college fund. Another funded a small cabin where I wrote code for myself again, slowly, deliberately, with no deadlines and no one watching the clock. I remembered why I started building things in the first place. Not to impress, to make them last. If there's a final irony in all of this, it's that the moment they stopped calling my work obsolete was the moment it stopped needing me. That's how you know you built something right. You don't win by being the loudest voice in the room. You win by understanding what actually holds the room up. And once you do, no one ever calls your work spaghetti again, at least not to your face. Years later, when people ask me what the turning point was, they expect a dramatic answer. A shouting match, a lawsuit, a public humiliation. I always disappoint them. The real turning point was quieter than that. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to defend my work to people who hadn't paid the price to understand it. The moment I stopped trying to translate experience into buzzwords just to be taken seriously by someone younger, louder, and more convinced of their own brilliance. I began choosing rooms where curiosity mattered more than confidence, where questions were valued over declarations, where "why does this exist?" came before "let's rip it out." In those rooms, my age wasn't a liability, it was context, history, memory, and memory, it turns out, is a competitive advantage. Occasionally, I'd see Trevor's name pop up on LinkedIn. New title, new company, same language, rebuilding from scratch, moving fast, breaking legacy. I'd scroll past without bitterness. I'd seen that movie before. It always ends the same way. Someone rediscovers the hard problems the spaghetti was quietly solving all along. The industry cycles, tools change, terminology refreshes itself every few years. But responsibility never goes out of style, neither does ownership. When you build something that carries real weight, financial, legal, human, you don't get to be careless with it, and you certainly don't get to mock it without consequence. I don't keep trophies from that job, no plaques, no farewell gifts. Just the contract folded neatly in a drawer and the knowledge that when it mattered, the work held. That's the ending they don't teach in management seminars. Sometimes the most lasting form of revenge is simply letting time expose who actually understood the system and who was just passing through. Time has a way of sanding the sharp edges off stories like this, leaving only the shape of the lesson behind. These days, when I sit across from younger engineers or new executives, I can usually tell within minutes which path they're on. Some are hungry to learn. They ask about trade-offs, about failure modes, about why certain ugly solutions survived longer than elegant ones. Others are chasing disruption for its own sake, convinced that anything old must be wrong. I don't argue with either type. Experience has taught me that people only hear lessons they're ready for. What I do share when asked is a simple truth. Systems remember. They remember every shortcut, every ignored warning, every decision made for optics instead of substance. You can rename files, refactor functions, migrate platforms, but the consequences of early choices echo for decades. The code doesn't forget even when leadership does. I no longer measure success by titles or org charts. I measure it by how few emergencies wake me up at night, by how often my work creates calm instead of chaos, by whether the people around me feel safer making thoughtful decisions instead of fast ones. That kind of success doesn't trend on social media, but it endures. Sometimes I think back to that moment when Trevor stood behind me, laughing at my screen. He thought he was naming a problem. What he was really doing was announcing his own blind spot. I didn't correct him then. I didn't need to. The system corrected him in time. If there's a final takeaway worth holding on to, it's this. Don't confuse age with irrelevance. Don't confuse confidence with competence. And never assume that what you didn't build is simple. Because somewhere beneath that so-called spaghetti is a structure holding everything together, and the person who understands it doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. And once you've lived through that kind of reckoning, you carry it with you, not as armor, but as awareness. I don't rush to prove myself anymore. I listen. I watch how decisions are made, how credit flows, how blame is assigned. I notice whether leaders ask who built something or only who's presenting it. Those signals tell me everything I need to know about how long I'll stay in a room. Some rooms are built for learning. Others are built for turnover. Every now and then, someone will joke about legacy systems or ancient code, and I'll smile to myself. Not because it's funny, but because I know what that language usually hides: impatience, inexperience, and a lack of respect for constraints they haven't yet been burned by. I don't correct them unless it matters. Most lessons are expensive. It's not my job to make them cheap. What I do instead is build slowly, deliberately, with exits clearly marked and ownership unmistakable. I leave trails, documentation, rationale, boundaries, so no one ever has to guess what belongs to whom. That clarity protects everyone involved. It keeps ego out of the critical path. If the story has an ending, it's not a single moment. It's a posture, a way of moving through work without fear of being erased. Because once you've had your work dismissed and watched it prove its worth anyway, you stop chasing approval altogether. You don't need applause. You don't need titles. You don't even need credit. You just need to know what you own and never forget it. Owning that truth changes how you show up everywhere else. You stop over-explaining. You stop softening your language so no one feels threatened. You state facts plainly and let silence do the rest of the work. People either rise to that clarity or shrink from it, and both reactions save you time. The ones who lean in are worth building with. The ones who bristle were never going to respect the work anyway. I've watched entire teams transform when one person refuses to let substance be treated like nostalgia. When someone calmly says, "Before we replace this, let's understand why it survived," the room shifts. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's responsible. That kind of thinking slows things down just enough to prevent expensive mistakes. It introduces memory into a culture obsessed with speed. And speed, I've learned, is often just fear in a hurry. The industry will keep cycling. New tools will arrive. Old ones will be mocked. Someone will always be eager to declare the past broken without bothering to understand what it solved. Let them. The people who build things that last don't need to win arguments in meetings. They win quietly over time as their systems keep working while trends burn out. I don't tell this story as a warning or a boast. I tell it because so many people are standing where I once stood, watching their work be dismissed by someone who inherited authority instead of earning understanding. If that's you, remember this: dismissal is not the same as being wrong. Sometimes it's just the prelude to being proven right. In the end, the code ran, the contracts held, the noise moved on, and I did too, lighter, clearer, and fully aware of exactly what I own. What stays with me most now isn't the insult or even the fallout, it's the calm that came after. The calm of knowing that my value was never tied to someone else's approval, only temporarily obscured by it. Once that fog lifted, everything else felt simpler. Decisions became cleaner. Priorities sharpened. I stopped mistaking friction for forward motion. I learned to trust time more than titles. Titles can be handed out by people who don't understand the work. Time, on the other hand, is brutally honest. It rewards what holds up and exposes what doesn't. The system I built didn't survive because I defended it loudly. It survived because it was necessary. Because reality kept choosing it day after day, no matter how unfashionable it looked in a slide deck. Now, when I walk away from projects, I leave them stronger than when I arrived, and I make sure the terms are clear. Ownership defined, responsibilities named. No ambiguity that someone else can later exploit. That clarity isn't arrogance, it's respect for the work and for myself. If someone still wants to call it spaghetti, that's fine. I know what it feeds. I know what collapses without it. And more importantly, I know when to walk away and let the truth surface on its own. That's the quiet power you earn when you stop trying to be modern enough, fast enough, or impressive enough for people who don't carry the consequences. You build, you protect what's yours, and you let time do the talking. In the end, there was no victory speech, no headline, no dramatic last word, just a quiet understanding that settled in and stayed. I wasn't fired because my work was bad. I was fired because it was misunderstood by someone who mistook confidence for comprehension. And when that misunderstanding met reality, reality didn't negotiate. It simply enforced the rules that had always been there. The CIO moved on. The company adjusted. The system kept running on my terms, and I moved forward without bitterness, without needing anyone to admit they were wrong. That's the part most people miss about corporate revenge. The strongest kind doesn't come from anger or humiliation. It comes from preparation, ownership, and patience. From knowing exactly what you built, exactly what you control, and exactly when to let go. They called my code boomer spaghetti. I called it leverage. And once you understand your leverage, you don't need to raise your voice ever again. It ended the way most real victories do, quietly, without witnesses, and without the need for anyone to admit fault. I didn't win because someone else lost their job or their pride. I won because I walked away with my ownership intact, my dignity untouched, and my future no longer tied to people who mistook experience for obsolescence. The system kept running, the contracts held, and the same work that was once mocked became the foundation no one dared to rip out again. That's the truth they don't teach in boardrooms or tech blogs. Innovation isn't about burning the past. It's about understanding it well enough to know what must endure. Anyone can tear something down. Very few know how to build something that survives the teardown. They laughed at my code. They fired me for it. Then they paid to keep it alive. And I moved on, not bitter, not loud, just fully aware of my worth and exactly what I own. So if this story lingers, let it linger for the right reason. Not because someone was insulted. Not because a title was taken away. But because it proves something quietly powerful. The people who build the foundations don't need to fight for the spotlight. The spotlight eventually comes looking for them, usually in the middle of a crisis when bravado runs out and only understanding remains. I never corrected the insult. I never demanded an apology. I let the contracts, the uptime, and the consequences speak instead. When you own your work legally, technically, and ethically, you don't have to explain your value. You just have to wait. They called it boomer spaghetti because they couldn't see the structure beneath it. I didn't take that personally. I took it seriously. And that's the real ending. I kept my leverage. I kept my calm. I kept my future. Everything else was just noise.